And Brooks, you're saying this is kind of been a challenging thing to forecast here.
It's a really difficult forecast because we've got this tropical wave sitting over the Lesser Antilles. It's sitting over the Leeward Islands. This is like near the British and Virgin Islands, the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Croix, also east of Puerto Rico. You can see that blob of thunderstorms. And it's also right now battling a huge area of dust. It's mired by this dust. You can almost see that on the satellite imagery, that kind of milky appearance to the sky north of it. That's Saharan dust, and that's acting as almost like a virtual chaperone, right? Making sure that this thing behaves and doesn't rapidly strengthen into something else. And essentially, this is going to track westward over the island of Hispaniola. That's the DR and also Haiti. And those are islands with big mountains, right? And also maybe even up through Cuba. And that'll help to keep it weak as well. So we've got the dust, we've got the terrain. And the bottom line is this is like an amorphous, undefined, ill-defined low that also the forecast is equally ill-defined because there's so many variables going into it. But at the end of the day, it's about 1,400 miles away. It's moving west-northwest at about 30 miles an hour. And at this speed and direction, it could bring, impact-wise, some flooding conditions to the islands with sporadic downpours, especially in some of the hillier terrain. Puerto Rico not exempt from that potential. Dominican Republic, Haiti, maybe the mountains of Cuba. And then from there, it moves into the Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas this weekend. And in doing so, once it enters a more favorable environment, away from all the terrain, and maybe free of some of that dust, there's a chance in this orange zone that we could see development, about a 60% chance, according to the National Hurricane Center. So, again, as this tropical wave moves into that Turks and Caicos, Bahamas area, which is located, if you don't know where it is on the map, that's below the 60% number there. It's those little islands. At that point, it could become a tropical depression. So this is not a cone of a forecast cone. This is just a zone in which it could develop. Then from there, a cone would be initiated based on its exact location at development. And that's important to know because its track will determine our impacts here in Florida very dramatically. If it stays east into the Atlantic, we'll have very little impact this weekend. If it tracks west into the Gulf, we'll have a much greater impact this weekend with scattered to numerous torrential rains and a real tropical feel out there. So, Garrett, this is definitely a developing situation, and we got computer models that go along with us in the next slide, featuring some of the track potentials. The one thing we're looking for is consistency, because the models have been all over the place, right? We have poor initialization because we don't have much data out there. That means the old concept of junk in and junk out. If you put junk into something and run through a model, you'll get junk out. So we have to look at history with model accuracy as well as consistency with every 6 to 12 hours when there's new model runs. Which model has been the most consistent in its messaging? And by far that's been the European model, which is that big red line taking it into the open Atlantic. And that's significant because that red line would be a path that would provide very little impacts here for Florida. The German model, the Canadian model, those are kind of secondary models, almost like tertiary models where we look at them, but they're not as considered. The green line is the USA model. That's the GFS model, and that takes it into the open Gulf. And so that would bring us a pretty wet scenario this weekend. It would be a weaker system moving into the Gulf, but once it moves into the northern Gulf, it would encounter some very warm water and would have a real potential to become a tropical storm or a hurricane, impacting anywhere from Louisiana into our own panhandle. And the UK model, which is the British model there in gray, kind of hints at the same situation, same setup. I do think, based on what we have as of right now, the European model is the most likely one. And the next slide does a good job of kind of summarizing that overall vibe that we'd have the highest potential for development east of Florida. So I wish I could bring a more definite answer on this Wednesday to what could be coming our way on Saturday and Sunday, because we're only several days away, but it's likely to be one of those things where we don't really know until it's within 36 hours of either a potential landfall or a near miss as it heads out into the open Atlantic. But I think overall, going to the next slide, this system, in whatever form it takes, will likely be weaker than it otherwise could be, thanks to all that dust in the terrain. And if you put this one in motion, you can see its track. But more so, it's a sign of what's to come. Our 1 month long hiatus from tropical activity, the lull, if you will, is about to end, and that'll open up the floodgates for system after system to develop as we head toward the peak of the hurricane season. Putting this map into motion, by Saturday, we're going to have a tropical wave or tropical depression in the Bahamas, making for a real wet weekend on the islands. But if it does go east of us, notice how all the red and yellow, that's the heaviest weather, stays so far east of Florida with this forecast scenario that if you didn't know that there's a tropical storm out there or a tropical depression, you'd have no idea about walking in your backyard. It would just be kind of a beautiful, breezy weekend setup for us here in Florida. So it's going to be one of those weekends where we either get hit with a lot of rain or a lot of nothing, and we're not going to know until probably Thursday, if not Friday. Don't like to have a forecast like that.
Yeah,
but prepare for the worst, hope for the best.
Right, that's kind of what you have to do in that situation. But staying off the coast obviously is the best case scenario at this point.
Right, as far as impacts here go, if it was to track east of us, it could develop into Tropical Storm Debbie and then maybe brush the Carolinas. Could even become a hurricane out there in the Atlantic, but it would be unlikely to affect us here in any kind of a capacity like that. So I think the takeaway here is that we're looking at a kind of a late bloomer. By the time it passes our latitude, the horizontal lines above the equator, once it passes our latitude, at that point it would have a higher chance of developing into something that would be a formidable system. But at this point for us, it would be a heavy rainmaker if it hit us square on the jaw. At this point, though, kind of thinking it's going to nudge out into the Atlantic based on the latest.
Yeah, still just a lot kind of up in the air at this point, so we will make sure to keep an eye on your updates.
You got